Hey, welcome back. As I said during the Columbian Exchange, I was going to talk to you about the triangular trade, which Columbian Exchange is part of, or actually the triangular trade is part of the Columbian Exchange. It is called triangular because there was a definite triangle created by this. So, the triangular trade, cause of more than one war actually. It's a trade route between Africa, Europe, and the Americans. And the most important part that you need to know about it is it was a slave trade as well. So what would happen once again, from the Americas, we would send sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe. Cotton originally comes from India, but they found that the southern North American area, especially the southeast, was a great place to grow cotton. Living in Arizona, we still grow cotton here. So these things would go to Europe. From Europe, they would send south to Africa textiles, rum, and manufactured goods. The rum actually comes from the Americas because it's sugar cane. So what had happened, the whole creation of rum, is the fact that some people like to get drunk. So you get these sailors and these settlers who are used to drinking alcohol. Well, guess what happens to wine if you try to transport it across the Atlantic without a good refrigeration system? Or a nice cool place for it to ferment? When you get here, it's vinegar. Red wine vinegar. Or white wine vinegar. So, rum is created. People figure out how to make alcohol out of sugar. If you need to know, they figured out how to make it out of corn, out of potatoes, out of you name it, somebody's figured it out. So they would then send these south to textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa. So what are we getting from Africa besides, say, diamonds and coffee beans? People. This was the slave part of the African slave. I know, or trade, the slave trade, that most of this is pointing north. However, it should be noted that most of the slaves taken directly from Africa, as if you listen to John Green, he will tell you, did not go to North America. They went to Brazil and the Caribbeans. Why? Because this is where your sugarcane plants are. The difference, however, is the slaves in this area did not have a long life and were not expected to reproduce, except the ones in Jamaica I told you about. The ones who are sent here actually have a decent lifespan. And what happened was they got married to each other. Well, they mated either with each other. Yes, the incidents where sometimes the plantation owner would take a fancy to one of the slaves or many of the slaves, and these women are not allowed to say no. There were plenty of slaves who were actually descended from plantation owners too. Which is why a lot of blacks today are actually descended from the plantation owners and the slaves, but usually the way it happened, not good. Very not good. So this is our triangular trade. Yes, there's it's not actually a video attached, it's a site, so you can see what it looks like, the ships coming over and how they increased. So the three groups who are the most guilty of slave trade were Spain. Three countries were Spain, Portugal, and England. Portugal started it. Remember, Brazil's Portuguese. Up until the 1840s, they were part of Portugal. And they actually kind of manufactured their own revolution by themselves. The royal family planned it out, the revolution. So Portugal is sending all of their slaves once again to Brazil, where they did not have if you made the journey, so if you first lived through the journey to the Americas, you were going to have a very nasty life. Very nasty, in short. So Brazil kept stealing people from Africa. I don't care how they, got them. Somebody stole them. Nobody, voluntarily went into slavery. Meanwhile, Spain was sending them to the Caribbean and Mexico, and then England started sending them to North America. So, at first, once again, there are few slaves in the English colonies. Well, when tobacco and cotton and rice start growing, we need more slaves, so they increase the slave trade. But once again, with England, it was less actually taking them from Africa. They did take them from Africa, but they bred their own slaves, basically. So, a enslaved female would give birth, and at some point, finally the United States made a law that it was 11, but the South was ignoring that. Their children would be ripped from their arms and sold. So Britain then, once again, was given control over much of the slave trade. They ended up having a monopoly in North America because they're just that way, and hence the triangle. So once again, Europeans take sugar, cotton, and rum, and tobacco and coffee back to Europe. Then they send this stuff down to Africa, along with pots, pans, guns, alcohol, and horses. And although at one point Africa had their own, then they send them back up, once again to usually the Caribbean for England, but then they'd come sometimes up to North America. Portugal's the one going down to Brazil. Here is a nice little map of the big areas where most of the slaves were being taken from. While it does say the Congo, it's just the western. Nobody can survive in there. The Congo's got its own self-defense. It's called disease. If you didn't grow up there, kind of a deadly place to be. However, Mauritania, Gambia, the Guineas, very vulnerable areas. More of our little maps. You'll notice as time goes on, suddenly the increase in the trade becomes bigger and bigger and bigger up until the 1700s, or as a matter of fact, well, I know this is still 1867. However, the only people in the slave trade up until 1867 who are importing is Brazil. In Great Britain itself, they ended up, long before the United States did, outlawing slavery. Then in the United States, it became illegal to import slaves. But once again, the slaves are having children. It's a self-perpetuating system where they were ripping the children from the parents' arms, selling them. They looked at these babies as goods, not people. There's a problem. So, what happens? First, what happens are crews with guns went ashore to capture slaves. Often, no, they did not capture their own. What they would do is purchase slaves from tribal leaders. So how are these tribal leaders getting these slaves? Number one, kidnapping. You've got a war with a neighboring tribe, you go in, you kidnap their people, sell them into slavery, you get money, they have less people, and they have a pretty bad life now. Trading. They would actually trade for the slaves that people were already enslaved. They'd give gifts. They would take people who are in debt into slavery, but often you're going to find, once again, that's an indentured servant. Usually not African. Those were usually Europeans, and they were eventually freed. Criminals. Once again, that's both African and European. The difference, once again, being the African, they don't care how. So you're a criminal. You're sold into slavery. They sell you. They ship you out if you survive. Your children are still enslaved. England kind of was doing this to their own. Remember Australia, entirely peopled by criminals. well, they were sending more of colonies. They did occasionally send like an Irish criminal, but once again, their children are free because their children look like everybody else. And prisoners of tribal war. That's actually should be number 1. So this, by the way, is a slave stick. They would, forked branch opens, you'll notice right here, to the size of a neck, so the head can't pass through it, basically. So you'll have that nice little bar under the chin, or on the neck, and it pierces 2 holes so that an iron pin can come through the neck of the slave, so that the smallest movement is sufficient to stop him, or even strangle him. This is the gore. Once again, that's actually a reenactment, thank goodness. I'll try to include this so you can not enjoy the beautiful pictures. So these African chiefs did resist at the beginning, but you're having tribal wars. If your neighbors are coming in with these weapons and taking you, well, what's your choice if you don't want your people enslaved? You need those guns, so you're going to attack them to get the guns, but then you have to take their people to send them back into slavery so you can afford these weapons coming down. The Europeans, once again, are too powerful to resist. Resisting was unsuccessful if you've been caught. And so, some more of our pictures. Once again, most of these are drawings. Remember, the camera wasn't invented until the 1800s. So slaves were held as prisoner along the west coast of Africa. They would bring them over there, wait for the ship. And then once the ship was there, they would get as many people as they, I can't use the word humanly because it was not human, but physically able to get on there. And those that were journeyed were in the interior of the ship. And if you're not fitting into the ship, you were left on the shores to just die, so they'd leave you tied up. This is Fort Elmina, where they kept several of the slaves, waiting to be transported. So you made it to the ship. So the voyage from Africa to the Americas, they sailed across the Atlantic from the Americas carrying both slaves and gold. It took about 5 to 12 weeks. You think staying home quarantined for 3 months was bad? Okay, we're still technically kind of quarantined. Well, this is good. At least you have room to move. Because these guys are in disgusting conditions. Some tried to jump ship. Some refused to eat. Some rebelled. To quote Black Panther, there were those who decided that death is better than being enslaved, and they really would jump from the ship to drown. But these sailors know if you lose the slave, you just lost the money for the slave. So they did try to keep them from being able to get out to jump. And, well, the refusing to eat is interesting. There's a reason there are more cases of diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, and so forth among African Americans than there are people in Africa. And it's their ability to not eat and their ability to hold salt in. So all these, nasty things that now cause disease for African Americans were the reasons that their ancestors ended up surviving this voyage. They can maintain their salt, they can go longer without eating, their bodies had to adjust, and because of their ability to adjust, it's caused medical problems for generations upon generations. So this was people left behind as the ship sailed off. These are actually sailors not trying to kill the slaves because they cost money. No, they're trying to keep them from jumping ship. And yes, some of them successfully jumped ship. because once again, it's better to just drown than to go into that life. Okay, next is the Middle Passage. Oh, this is bad. So, what they would do is loose packing. Captains took fewer slaves in the hold, sometimes to reduce sickness and death. Meaning, okay, you know what? We're not going to take as many slaves, but this way we're not going to lose as many on the voyage, as many people. Tight packing, well, have you seen a can of sardines? That's tight packing. They carried as many slaves as their ships could physically hold, and as a result, many did die on the voyage. And that is tight packing. And literally, they would be stuck there, laying there for 5 to 12 weeks, foot to head. And as bad as that looks, if you've seen the actual pictures, it's worse. So that is, at least these guys got to sit. They can't lay down. But that is actually more humane than if you saw a picture of what that looked like. This is more loose packing. At least they can lay down. They can move about. Notice this nice group who can't even stand. Yeah. The kegs of beer got more room. This is more of an example of tight packing. Yes, they literally had to lay down. Those are examples of leg shackles. That is a nice political cartoon you will see later. And here we go. Once again, head to foot, forced to lay down, and they would be like that for months. Months. So next, the Homeward Passage. This is where they are going to be sold at auction. We'll get into that later. Next class period, instead of trying to do this all in one day, especially since you have writing to do.